Welcome to Philosophy Insights. Today's topic is wokeness versus science. Recently, Michael Shermer, one of the most popular science communicators and historians of science, recently got cut loose by the magazine Scientific American, for which he wrote for many years. Science American is the oldest continuously published monthly magazine in the United States, going back to 1845. Here is Shermer about the reason for the cancellation of his column connected to wokeness.
So I started Scientific American in 2001, and I went almost 18 years, 214 consecutive monthly columns. I was going for Steve Gould's 300 that he did in Natural History Magazine, which would have taken me to April 2025, so I didn't quite make that. They terminated the column. There was no particular reason given other than, well, we're going different ways, and it's time for a change. They didn't say, hey, we've gone woke and you're an old non-woke guy, right? So, but I could kind of see the writing on the wall. Last couple columns I had written were dealing with some issues kind of related to race and sex and gender and that sort of thing, and I could feel the uncomfortableness in the editorial process, and then boom, they let it go.
One of Shermer's last articles was a column called Scientific American Goes Woke. This is what he was writing.
I went through a bunch of articles they had published recently that were clearly what most people would identify as sort of a far left, woke, progressive politics.
And one of the most notorious or discussed pieces had to do with E.O. Wilson being a racist, right? Being a scientific racist. He wrote the book Sociobiology. He, in a lot of ways, his vision of taking evolution and seriously applying it or trying to apply to human society and whatnot had always been a fraught project, right?
Yes,
I mean, he was getting pictures of water poured over him in the 70s at conferences. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was one of them.
And you wrote about that.
Yeah, in fact, they published this right after he died, so the body's not even cold yet, and already he's being accused of being a kind of race realist, race science, racist, implied racist, that kind of thing, even though he's not. So one of my other Substacks was a long piece kind of dissecting the claims against Wilson, show that they're absolutely false. But the worst thing about the Scientific American piece on him was that they provided no evidence at all, no quotes from him, saying something about the racial differences in IQ, nothing like that. And in fact, there's tons of quotes from him that I included in my piece where he's like, this can absolutely not be considered evidence of racial differences between groups, and and this is no justification for discrimination of any kind. I abhor the kind of the old race science stuff. I mean, he made it clear he doesn't go into any of that. So that was disturbing. They had another one on how mathematics has kind of gone racist and bigoted and misogynistic. And their evidence for this is that there are more male math professors than female math professors, which is not, I mean, the explanation for that could be that, well, all these old guys are just misogynists against women. But there are other hypotheses, and you would think a scientific publication would say, okay, here are the 3 explanations for why there is an asymmetry in the number of professors who are male versus female, right? So you have, well, maybe they're just a bunch of misogynists, okay? Maybe there's a pipeline issue, right? That decades ago, young girls went different pathways than young boys, and fewer of them ended up in STEM fields, so that by the time you get to now where they're being hired, there's just few of them to select for, because every professor I know is uber liberal, and they're all dying to hire more women in STEM fields. So it's not like behind closed doors they're going, hey, I know we said this publicly, but we just want to hire more white guys. They're not doing that, right? So what are some other hypotheses here? The evolutionary psych one is, well, there may be an interest difference, that men migrate, boys migrate toward toys and things and stuff. Women, girls migrate more toward people. And so that kind of sorts out later, decades later, into the kind of profession you prefer to go into. So women tend to migrate more toward medical degrees and biology and psychology, social science, men more in the STEM fields.
Now the interesting question arises, why do science publications push wokeness so heavily? One explanation about the genesis is that wokeness started in the universities, but this culture is now slowly moving into the real world, and here it is especially brought in the company by the mid-level management. Shermer has a different, more psychological explanation.
And I think it makes people feel like I'm doing something, right? Like, again, what can I do about the George Floyd thing or police violence or whatever? Nothing, but I can go down and march, right? I'm going down there this afternoon and I'm going to carry my flag. Makes me feel like I'm doing something because, humans are very moral. We're moralistic. We like to moralize about things and express our
And
outrage.
that kind of protest does have effect, right?
Yes, it can,
It
right?
can,
Absolutely, absolutely.
You
So that's all
mentioned
good.
earlier on, kind of being of an older vintage. We're of similar vintage. How old are you?
I'm 67.
Okay, so is part of this just like, when we call it wokeism, 20 years ago we would have called it political correctness.
Right.
I think our parents were, we disappointed them, or we defined ourselves against them. Is part of the woke conversation real? It's just generational warfare that is to be expected, and if not tolerated, like, of course, right? I mean, this is a way, and I hate to say it in this crude a term, but like, so you're a guy, you're an old guy, you've been on the masthead of Scientific American for 20 years, and it's like, you're not retiring. You're probably in better health than you were 10 years ago, and it looks like you're going to live forever. Like, how the fuck do we get rid of you?
Right. So yeah, have we become our parents? There may be a little bit of that, just kind of a generational shifts, but that doesn't really matter. The question is, what's the right thing to do? What's the truth? What's the direction we want to take the country, and what do we really know about this subject or that subject? Right. So,
I mean, if I may, you have in one of the Substack columns a fantastic piece where you say your raison d'etre is to figure out what is right, not to be right.
Yeah.
That's a
right.
powerful statement. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yes, well, because I study belief systems for a living, and I'm aware of all the cognitive biases. I can see them in myself, and so to avoid that, you just have to kind of focus on, instead of looking for evidence, confirmation bias, to support what I already believe, got to look for the counter evidence. What are the arguments against the beliefs I hold? Like this issue on abortion, I'm hardcore pro-choice, but I purposely solicited a pro-life argument and said, please give me like the 10 best arguments you have. I want to hear them, right? Because I don't really know what they are because I don't pay attention to it that closely, right? So we end up doing that. That you have to do in general.
And is wokeism, for lack of a better term, or identity politics, are you worried about it, not because, you lose your Scientific American column as much as this means we're not focused on trying to figure out what is right, what is true, what is correct, but rather we're kind of trying to create a narrative and maintain things that may or may not be true?
Yeah, the word woke is pretty loaded now, and it's changed already. I heard John McWhorter talking about this, the linguist. It used to be a cool term. I mean, you and I would have been woke probably in the 90s because we were libertarian in favor of individual freedom and rights or whatever. And now that word means something completely different. So, but in general, and I don't want to pick on Scientific American. I like the people I work with there and so forth. It's happening across the board. Twitter is mostly run by these kind of woke progressives, and most Science and Nature, the two most prominent publications, are running articles about this. And the Lancet had that cover story of, medicine has long neglected, what was it? People who give birth.
Right.
Like, if only we had a word for this.
Right.
That kind of thing. So, the language.
But there is a truth. I mean, like, beyond the language terminology, it is true that, like, women, women who give birth were oftentimes in medical discourse were kind of seen as like bystanders.
Well, yes.
Right. So there is a sociology here that's worth kind of rehearsing and understanding and unpacking.
Well, and I think the second wave feminists I've talked to, like Helen Joyce, Carol Tavris, they're very worried about the kind of woke gender identity movement because it's reducing women to just body parts. Like a guy can say, well, if I just get breast implants and I can have a vaginoplasty made out of a piece of my skin, then I'm a woman, right? It's like, well, no.
So Shermer argues that the rise of wokeness has to do with making activists feel good about themselves. I want to note here that it is, furthermore, feeling good at no cost. So it is a paradigm case for virtue signaling. You can show your in-group how virtuous you are, but you do not really have to do anything. If you are interested in Shermer's last point, how second-wave feminists are often critical about wokeness, watch my 5 years anniversary video where I go through one such case in detail based on an article by the famous German feminist Alice Schwarzer. Link below. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and hit the bell.